As we are taping, there have been no decisions regarding a government shutdown or a budget resolution. So to talk a little more broadly about what a shutdown could mean, we have University of Minnesota professor Kathryn Pearson. Thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Dr. Pearson, we'd like to ask you, first of all, much has been said, obviously, in the media about this impending government shutdown that could happen and how it differs from 2005. So in your opinion, is this unprecedented?
It is. And the scope would be far-reaching. It would impact many Minnesotans in many different walks of life. And I think that the governor and lawmakers are really keenly aware of that as they enter these negotiations with July 1st looming around the corner.
And can you think of any of those ripple effects that perhaps haven't been over dramatized in the media to this point?
Well, I think just in recent days, the media is doing a really good job of sort of explaining just how far-reaching this would be, and in particularly in the last couple of hours in the wake of Judge Guerin's ruling that really it would only be the core functions of government that would maintain open if the government were to shut down on July 1. And so we're hearing from people who would be concerned about everything from recreational benefits that the state provides, such as state parks, fishing licenses, driver's licenses, things of that nature, to really more pressing daily issues, such as childcare not associated with any federal program. And so a shutdown would really impact many people. I mean, many more state employees would be out of work than still working if it is just the core government functions that stay open if there's a shutdown.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the unique factors and maybe some of the personalities. What do you think some of those factors are that perhaps led us to this point?
Well, I think we're looking at sort of issues of politics, both substantive politics and sort of electoral politics. We have different constituencies that the governor is speaking to, that legislators are speaking to. So the governor campaigned very clearly, almost unusually clearly, on his desire to raise taxes for the wealthiest Minnesotans, that would be part of his budget plan to increase revenue. House and Senate Republicans, on the other hand, campaigned very clearly about cutting spending, that was sort of a key component on which they ran as it relates to jobs and the economy. But everyone knew during the campaign, day one, when the legislature opened, that the budget negotiations would be the most pressing issue before the legislature and before the governor. And so the problem is that each actor is trying to appeal to a different constituency. I mean, the House and Senate majority leaders, they're worrying about keeping their members happy electorally, happy substantively, because we're looking at a governor and Republican leadership with really very different ideological perspectives on the best way to deal with a budget deficit.
And so given that, what do you think needs to happen for there to be a resolution here? Who needs to give? Is it both?
Everyone needs to give, and everyone needs to realize that they are not going to be able to keep all of their constituencies happy. But ultimately, the budget has to come into balance, and I think that lawmakers and the governor are beginning to realize, if this doesn't happen until September, October, they are far worse off than they are if this happens now to avoid this July 1 shutdown. Because if there's a shutdown come July 1, people are going to be very angry. I mean, it's already become clear that many Minnesotans who hadn't perhaps been thinking about politics will be affected. But I think that if there is a shutdown, these effects will only become accentuated, and legislators going back to their district over the 4th of July, throughout the summer, if there is a shutdown, they will hear from some very angry constituents who perhaps before then didn't think about some of the ways in which state services may affect their lives.
And so who do you think, if there is a shutdown, are there any winners in this scenario?
No. And I think, but of course, with a budget deal, everyone will be somewhat unhappy. And everyone, to some extent, if there's a budget deal, will have to at least bend on a campaign promise. But here we really see the juxtaposition of campaigning and governing. And governing requires compromise, and governing requires a commitment to institutional capacity and to keep the trains running on time. And campaigning doesn't. And so particularly with so many new members of both parties, but particularly on the Republican side, I think we're seeing just how much more difficult it is perhaps to govern than it is to campaign.
And you bring up govern, so I want to ask you, have we moved into a legislative cycle where special sessions are the norm, maybe government shutdowns could be as well? And is this good for governance?
Well, one of the things that we're experiencing here is partisan polarization. Partisan polarization that is fueled by real substantive differences between members of the two parties, but also political differences. Differences between the activists who are most likely to show up for their precinct caucuses and to show up at party conventions, and activists who put real fear into legislators in both parties about challenges from the extremes. You know, challenges for Republicans from a Tea Party candidate on the right, for DFLers, challenges from the left. And that's certainly not the norm, but it is possible, and we've seen it. And so members of both parties are inclined to support their party, not support sort of this bipartisan compromise. And so the result is more special sessions and potentially more government shutdowns. I mean, we've seen this, these shutdown politics at the federal level persistently during times of divided government. It was, of course, avoided most recently, but we have seen these shutdown politics play out.
So, Professor, as an educator, are you maybe taking a step back from all of this? And what do you hope to learn and gain from this that you can then teach to your students down the road?
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that is so striking about this is what I mentioned earlier about the differences between campaigning, campaigning on sort of, bold promises, but perhaps extreme promises on both sides, and the compromises required to govern. One thing that I've also observed with my students is how when individuals run for the legislature, they often do so by bashing government, portraying themselves as an outsider. But then once elected, you become an insider, and these outsider politics are not necessarily conducive to governing, and so I think we're really seeing this play out. Obviously not so much with the legislative leaders and the governor who have been in these meetings for days and really are trying to come up with a compromise, but with the members of both caucuses that they have to ultimately they have to get a majority of members in each chamber to support whatever compromise might emerge.
And so regardless of whether or not there's a shutdown, do you think that the polls are going to be impacted in 2012?
I do. I think if there isn't a shutdown, voters may forget somewhat about this by 2012. But if there is a shutdown, absolutely. I think voters will be angry at everyone if there is a shutdown. I mean, I think it will be a pox on, both houses, the governor. There will just be general anger that a compromise could not be worked out to avert a shutdown. But let's keep in mind who's on the ballot in 2012. The governor's not on the ballot, but of course every senator and every representative is on the ballot. And so I think that this will be a huge issue in the campaign, but not just in the campaign. I mean, really, if there's a shutdown going forward, legislators on both sides of the aisle will hear from very angry constituents whose lives are disrupted in anything from minor to really quite significant ways.
Okay, Dr. Kathryn Pearson, thanks so much for your time and your perspective today. We certainly appreciate it.
A pleasure. Thanks for having me.